The word of the day, is eschaton. It's a Greek word. I see Dean writing it down. ESCHATON, eschaton. Say it with me. Eschaton. If you want to get fancy, the study of the eschaton, we call it eschatology. And if you want to look really like you've been to church, you can use that as an adjective and talk about something being eschatological. All of these things are things we do in the church. I guess we don't really do. We do them in seminary. How about that? But the word eschaton is Greek, and it comes to us from the Greek, and it means the end of times. It is the idea that at some point the world will end. It's a fascinating study, a fascinating area of our theology to study, eschatology. If we look at Jewish history and Jewish theology, particularly Jewish theology of the time of Jesus, eschatology is right there in the midst of what we see playing out in Jesus's time, and indeed in much of the Old Testament. There was a sense in Jewish theology that there would be an end point, and that the end point would begin when the Messiah, the Messiah, comes from the east over the Mount of Olives. And that is why today the most prominent and significant Jewish cemetery in all of Judaism is right there on the Mount of Olives. People are buried there because they want a front row seat to the end of times. In fact, the idea goes so far as to say that that when the Messiah comes and the end of times begins, he will enter into the Golden Gate, which is one of the gates into the Temple Mount complex. And when the Muslims took over Jerusalem, they ended up boarding up that gate so as to sort of make clear that that idea was sort of, not going to happen. And in fact, they went even further as to put a Muslim cemetery right outside that gate, with the understanding that the Messiah would never walk through among the dead. And so it was meant as a real way of kind of cementing and preventing the end of times. Jewish theologians afterwards said, yes, but it's the Son of God, it's the Messiah. You don't think that the Messiah can just go over it? And then modern day Islamic thinkers say, well, yes, but the Messiah will come from Bethlehem, and there's a wall there now. So forget getting over the wall and the Golden Gate. They've got to get through the checkpoints. These are debates that still play out, and the eschaton has yet to come. Christianity has this idea as well, the idea that there will be an end point. And we hear that strongly in the gospel that this morning from what Jesus says. When Jesus is talking about the idea, the day of the Lord, Paul uses that terminology in 1 Thessalonians, the day of the Lord. Keep awake, for you do not know when the master will return. That's the idea behind the parable, right? Notice at the beginning when it says that the master leaves and they don't know when he's coming back. They come back at an unexpected time. And so they're not given a sense of, I'll be gone for a week or a month. It's, I will return and you won't know when I will return. So there's a sense of unexpectedness that this moment will come. John the Divine, in his writings in the book of Revelation, gives us a further picture of the end of times, really beginning to put some visuals to it. And in fact, that's what makes it such a profound book. The idea in great detail of the way in which the world will end. A lot of that is metaphorical and allegorical, but it still is fundamentally eschatological. See, I did it. Rooted in the idea that there will be a point at which the world will end. That's the theme in so many ways of the book of Revelation. And we have that too. In just a few minutes, when we say the Apostles' Creed, we will say that Christ was died, he was buried, he ascended into heaven, and he will come again. We say a similar version of that when we do the Eucharistic prayer. Christ has died, Christ is risen. What's the next line? Christ will come again. So there is this sense, even within our theology, is there not, that there will be a point at which Christ will return, and that return will beget something new, that the world as we know it will cease to exist, and that this new time with Christ's second coming will be fundamentally different than every day before it. Like Simon Bar Kokhba, Christians have also fallen into the idea that the end of times were near. Many of you know of my passion and support of the Spafford Children's Center in Jerusalem. It's a center that helps kids with learning disabilities and who have experienced different kinds of trauma, and it provides therapy and remedial education. And it's just this little thing that I love in one of my little homes in the old city in Jerusalem. It was founded by Horatio and Anna Spafford. Horatio wrote the great hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." They founded the center when they moved to Jerusalem. But the question is, why did they move to Jerusalem? Well, they moved to Jerusalem from Chicago in the 1800s because they had experienced such great trauma in their own lives that they thought that was a sign that the world was ending. And so in response to the world ending, they moved from Chicago to Jerusalem at a time when nobody was doing anything like that. And they started the American colony and started bringing in families from America and Europe and said, let's get to work because the end of times is near. And when the Messiah comes, when Jesus comes on his second coming, we want him to see us at work caring for people. We want him to see us at work building the kingdom of God. It's fundamental to their whole idea of going and resettling in Jerusalem and beginning to do brave humanitarian work at a time when few people were doing that. Flash forward about 140 years later, you might remember this name because when I looked it up, I went, oh, I remember that name. Do you remember a name called Harold Camping? But in 2011, Harold Camping was a non-denominational preacher of sorts who believed that 2011 would be the end of times, and that it would be in May 21st would begin the Great Tribulation, and the world would come to its end. And what happened on May 22nd? Reporter stood outside his house, and he finally came out and said, "Well, I'm a little confused, and I'll get back to you tomorrow." And he did. He said, well, I think I misread that. I think actually the end of times is coming in October 21st of 2011. And so the same thing happened. They waited, and October 22nd came, and he said, I think I'm going to get out of the business of predicting the end of the world. Many people I know have asked sort of under their breath if this was the end of the world this year. Indeed, in the beginning of March, it may have seemed like we were on that path. We were about to experience something that none of us had ever done before, none of us. And we weren't sure how we were going to do it. The sweeping nature of it, the sense that it affected every human life on the planet, sort of fueled that idea that the eschaton was upon us. And many people have sort of lived this year with the sense that perhaps the world was ending. Now, I don't believe that the world will end this year, but I only say that because I just have a hunch. It's not particularly rooted in anything that Jesus tells us. In fact, Jesus says kind of the opposite. Be on guard. Do not take every day for granted. Do not assume that you will have another day, that you will get to see the sun rise again. Your life is not yours. So don't expect to be able to live it out, because your life is a gift from God. And tomorrow, if it comes, is a gift from God. Be on watch, therefore. Keep awake, for you do not know when the Messiah is to return. Live out your life. Live out today with the expectation that you will not have tomorrow. How often we take that for granted. In fact, I think actually Christian theology is beginning to change, because at the very beginning, going back 2,000 years ago, they all thought the end of times was coming. They all thought Jesus would return in their lifetime. They were certain of it. And when he didn't, they began to ask questions, and a new sense of theology came about. that we were meant to live with the understanding that Jesus would return, even if it wasn't in our lifetime. And because there's been so many generations after that, we've now begun to assume that there will be generations to come. And in a sense, we've lost that sense of warning. But that sense of warning that Jesus gives us, he gives us over and over and over again. Look at the parable. I am leaving for a time, says the master, but I will be back. And you don't know when I will be back, but when I come back, I will do an accounting. I will see what you've done, and you'll be held accountable for that. This year, in a sense, has been a blessing because it has taught us to live more in the uncertainty of our life. I know that. Every fall in August, particularly, I love to plan the coming program year. Our vestry knows how very frustrated I was when that didn't happen. And our big Sunday after Labor Day, where we have our big picnic, and gosh, we had a bagpiper last year. None of that happened. And people said, well, what are we doing for this year? And I said, I don't know. We'll try it 1 week at a time. I actually take great comfort from a TV show I've watched since I was a kid, Saturday Night Live. You know, they normally release a whole season's worth of guests, and when all the shows and the musical guests and the different hosts are there. And I've noticed this year they've only just started doing like 1 week, and they'll only announce it like a week in advance. And actually the last time they did it, they only had the host. They didn't have a musical guest yet. And I thought, you know, in 47 years of that show, they've never done that. But it's a reminder that even they, this sort of venerable, I say, American institution, it's been around since 1975, even they are just trying to do it week by week. It was almost as if to say, look, we found a host. Give us another couple of days. Maybe we'll find a musical guest. Maybe we won't. Maybe there'll be an outbreak here in the studio and we won't be able to do a show at all. Who knows? But we're going to try. We live into the uncertainty of it. What has this year taught you about the uncertainty of life? Maybe more to the point, how do we prepare for the uncertainty of life? In our burial rite, there's a collect that is offered as an optional collect, but it has this wonderful phrase, make us aware, Lord, of the uncertainty and shortness of human life. And all the collects you see are there to point us to take on values and virtues with the understanding that we'd struggle with them. There's not a collect that says, Lord, I have enjoyed this lazy day. Please give me many more. No, there's collects that call us to action, call us to stir up our hearts. One phrase I love, arouse the careless. But this one in our burial rite, make us aware of the uncertainty and shortness of human life. Why is that? Perhaps that we might live every day in the knowledge that we don't know when the next one will come. As we ask ourselves how the uncertainty of life, how that lesson has evolved for us this year, I want to add another question. This is a sermon with homework. Do we live in a theology of scarcity, or do we live in a theology of abundance? Have you ever heard that term before? You can nod if you have. Theology of scarcity is the idea that I have very little and I'm not certain I'll get more, and so I'm going to hoard what I have. I saw a friend say, well, looks like it's that time to start stocking up on toilet paper again. Please don't do that. That's a theology of scarcity. My seminary, General Theological Seminary, 200 years of history up there in New York, they went through a time of theological scarcity. Their membership and enrollment was declining. The neighborhood around them was going from being an awful, awful, dangerous part of Manhattan to perhaps the most fancy and swanky and expensive part of Manhattan. And all of a sudden, the property that they were clinging on to, property that was about ready to fall down, had to be sold off in order to make up for debt. And there was a great panic among the community. We are losing these things. Then that panic turned to an understanding that we had already lost them. And perhaps all the more, they were never ours to hold on to. And that by letting them go, we might pay off our debt. And then when we pay off our debt, perhaps we can build a community that is a little scrappier and a little more hopeful. And maybe doesn't have all of the next 5 years on a budget plan figured out, but lives with the certainty that God does, that God will find a way. Within years, they went from a theology of scarcity to a theology of abundance. Even now, I see that in communities around us. St. James School, they don't have an endowment. They live year to year, just as we do. But they're building a building to expand because they're hopeful. They want to prepare for better days. Same too goes with our neighbors up the street just a little bit. Did you know Newtown Square Presbyterian is launching a building campaign? They're expanding their building too. At a time when none of us really get to use our buildings, they're adding on, such as their hopefulness. Kudos to them. God bless them in their endeavor. Do we live in a theology of scarcity or a theology of abundance? And before we end, let me break that down a little further into 3 categories. The first is time. Do we live with a sense of scarcity of time? That my time is short, and therefore I better prioritize it and better put it to things that meet my immediate needs? Or do I make time for others? Do I give time away? Do I share it with my community and with my friends? Do I invest in relationships, even if I don't see how they might immediately benefit me? If we think of friendships as transactional, you can see how maybe perhaps it's not worth the time to invest in a friendship if you don't think you're going to get anything out of it. But maybe you also have friendships that have lasted decades, and you're so glad that you made those investments. And you continue to, even if you don't know if you'll even ever see them again, such as to live in a theology of abundance with our time. Same goes for money. That's the second one. Are we holding on to it this year with a sense that we don't know where our paychecks will come from next year? It'd be understandable to do so. Or do we take our first gifts and give them away? Do we pay off all of our debt and put money in savings, and then when we have money left over, we give it to those in need? Or do they come first in our giving priorities? This is what it is to ask ourselves. Do we budget and spend with a theology of scarcity or theology of abundance? The last is prayer. How do you pray this year? Do you pray for yourself? Good, you should. Do you only pray for yourself? Is your prayer always about, Lord, help me get through this moment? If it is, then perhaps you might be the center of your concerns. But if you're praying for others, then it is to suggest that perhaps there's a little space in your heart for others, a space in your heart at a time when many of us feel like our hearts, even our hearts, are under siege. When we start praying for the well-being of others, I promise you our hearts convert to a theology of abundance. We find that we have time to care for others around us. We have time to care for the world. When we do that, suddenly our finances begin to change. We begin to put our money where our prayers are, and our time too. We find time to care for those who are in greater challenge than we are, such as to live in a theology of abundance. In the parable, the third slave buries the money. He's fearful that he'll lose it, so he buries it. And when he's held to account, all he has to offer is the money that was buried. The other two invest it. They put it to use. Now, I don't think the world will end tomorrow, but it might. And there will be an accounting when it does. And each of us will be called by God to show our receipts, if you will. both real, tangible receipts and receipts of our time and receipts of our heart and of our prayers. And all of that will come with a question that perhaps ought to haunt us a little bit, especially as we look towards Advent and Christmas and prepare places in our hearts for the coming of the Christ child. Was all that I gave you, was it to glorify you, or was it to glorify me? Amen.